past week, as we gathered for prayer, I know a lot of you had been watching the General Conference in St. Louis unfold. And last week during prayer, we talked a little bit about what happened and who we were holding in tender thought and prayer as the General Conference in St. Louis had wrapped up, and LGBTQ clergy and lay people across the United Methodist Church and everybody who's looking on with us thought, what happened? Today we're going to talk a little bit more closely about what happened at the General Conference, where the United Methodist Church is now, and I'm going to offer you the opportunity to ask some questions with the caveat that I'm not an expert yet, and in fact I think nobody is an expert yet because there's a lot that remains to be seen. Will you pray with me? Holy God, speak into the midst of our brokenness. Speak into the midst of division, and help us to break the chains that bind us. Help us to see your will and your way. Amen. So I want to back up from General Conference a little bit. From before I knew about the General Church and who was a part of it and what happened, it was my first year as a real practicing Christian. I felt like a Pinocchio. I was a real girl, right? That year, later on, I would be baptized, and as the spring was coming up, I dove headfirst into the traditions of the church. Advent was this glorious, beautiful, rich time. I love the color of Advent, and Lent is purple. It just feels like rich and full. And I was just, I couldn't get enough of the church. I told you 2 weeks ago in my call story that I stumbled upon choir as a handy excuse to go to church 3 times in a Sunday. I couldn't get enough of it. I just wanted to hear the sermon over and over again. And then suddenly we were talking about Lent. And then in addition to all of the Sunday services, our church was having a midweek prayer service, and we had Ash Wednesday and Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. And it just felt really exciting to go to church so much. I felt like I was going to be filled up with more sacredness than I ever thought possible. I remember wanting to be as close to the church and to the items in the church that felt holy, as close as I could. Our youth group would meet in the sanctuary, which was a really special thing. We had a whole, it's the South, so we had a whole youth wing because there were 50 kids who came to youth group every week. And so that's where we usually had youth group. And then in Lent, we moved up and had this worship service in the sanctuary, where our sanctuary was shaped sort of like this, but there was no communion rail. It was like a wooden platform, only maybe this high, or maybe this high. It had 2 or 3 stairs. And so we all came and gathered right around the front. There was space for us sort of up here in the chancel area, and we were gathered around, seated on the floor with each other, and it just felt holy. Church for me felt set apart, different from any other space I had ever been in before, and so special. And I kept feeling like if I'm close to the home of God, this place where God lives, this building where God lives, then I too could be holy and sacred and set apart. And so when our youth leaders and our pastors started talking to us and how Christians have historically practiced Lent as this time of fasting and prayer and penitence, I was like, yeah, sign me up. I want to be as Christian as it's possible to be. So what do I have to do? Do I have to fast? Do I have to take on extra prayer practice? Do I have to, oh, God forbid, come to church again? This was really exciting to me. And I wanted to be loud about my fasting and my prayer, especially because I was so excited about my newfound faith, and my parents were a little skeptical. They were still attending the Unitarian Universalist Church, which was a beautiful place for me to grow up, but here I was so excited about my new faith, and I wanted to show my parents how serious I was about it, right? So I decided I wanted to fast for Lent. Not give up chocolate, but fast for Lent. During the daytime, I decided that I was going to fast. I wasn't going to eat any food. I would drink only water, and then I would break my fast in the evening. And I was so showy about it. My parents would invite me to dinner, and I would sit there with an empty plate Or when I got really hungry in the middle of the day, I would put on a really sad face. I would make sure that everybody knew that I was hungry because I was fasting for Lent. And don't you want to ask me more now about my faith? This text in Isaiah draws a comparison between ritual fasting and relationship. A ritual is something that is done in a moment or over a confined period of time and is meant to symbolize for us the particular aspect of faith that God wants us to achieve, right? Relationship changes you forever. Relationship causes us to look at the world through a lens of love. So back to the United Methodist Church. Well before I was born, in 1972, at the General Conference, which only meets every 4 years and is the only body which has the authority to speak on behalf of the entire denomination, almost on a whim and unexpected to most of the delegates, someone raised a petition that we should add to the social principles a statement that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Well, the body didn't know what had happened. It was not something that the body was really prepared for. It was not legislation that had been written ahead of time and sent in, but just a petition lifted from the floor. And suddenly, before anybody knew it, it had been adopted into church law. That homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Well, at the time, we had only had female ministers for 22 years. And the progressive caucus of the church was not founded or unified by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South had just the Methodist Episcopal Church had just happened in 1968, just 4 years before, just at the last General Conference. This whole life together as United Methodist thing had just begun. And suddenly we had added this piece to our book of discipline, our rule book, our guidelines for our social understanding that excluded an entire group of people based on their sexual orientation. For the next 47 years, there have been groups of people trying to reverse that language. And similarly, there have been groups of people trying to strengthen that language and to write into our codes and regulations, our polity, consequences for standing outside of that statement. And so finally, this comes to a head, right? We have a gradually polarizing United Methodist Church who are gradually getting farther and farther apart on their understandings of what should happen in the church. And it comes up every general conference. Every general conference, we have a conversation and an argument about what should happen with regards to LGBTQ people. Until finally, at General Conference 2016 in Portland, after 44 years of debate, General Conference asked the bishops to provide some new format, some container to hold this conversation that was not at our General Conference. We were spending maybe half of our time at general conferences in the later years talking about LGBTQ people, and I think that everybody across the square, there are better ways to be spending our time. And so the bishops were asked to take on this work of creating a new container for us to hold this conversation so that we don't have to come back every 4 years and argue with each other, fight with each other. And the bishops instituted this Way Forward committee. So folks were nominated and selected by the Council of Bishops to work for 2 to 4 years of studying and praying and listening. And if they believed that it was the right course forward, they had the authority to ask the Council of Bishops to set a special called session of the General Conference, a special session that dealt just with LGBTQ ministry, relationship, and how the global church would adapt to that. So their central question was this: given the global nature of the church, a changing culture, and the vast theological differences within our denomination, how shall we care for and be in ministry with LGBTQ persons while maintaining the unity of our church? So the Way Forward Committee was asked to find a center path, probably, between these two poles of opinion in the church. So after they met for 2 years, this group, this very diverse group of 32 people, folks who were LGBTQ and folks who were not, folks who were from the United States and folks who were not, folks who were progressive and folks who were conservative. The Commission on a Way Forward presented a plan. They called it the One Church Plan. And in this plan permitted that local churches would be able to decide by a vote of the congregation whether to host same-sex weddings. Local churches would be able to indicate to their cabinets, to their bishop, whether the congregation would be open to having an LGBTQ clergy person. Annual conferences and local churches and clergy would have been granted greater flexibility in making decisions that were specific to their social context. So if you lived in a place that was really conservative and your church was really conservative, you wouldn't be forced to adopt any new position or policy. You wouldn't be forced to host a same-sex wedding. But similarly, if you live in a place that's progressive and where there's a greater level of acceptance in your congregation, you would have the permission to practice freely. And like I said, conservative conferences and churches and clergy would be free to continue observing the current prohibitions on LGBTQ clergy and weddings. Now, what actually happened was the Way Forward Commission, the One Church Plan, outlined a way to codify how much of our church has already been living. The western jurisdiction of the church and most of the northeast jurisdiction of the church had already said, we are standing outside the consensus. We are standing outside the statement in the Book of Discipline that says homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. As early as 1980, the Reconciling Congregations program started allowing churches to affiliate in defiance of this Book of Discipline statement. And so the Way Forward Commission says, look, we're already living sort of these two poles of the church. Instead of continuing to see one side of the church as wrong and as needing to be cleansed and purified, let's just set into law how we've already been living. Let's be honest about how our church has already been living and recognize that it is a benefit to us to have this rich theological diversity, because it's in those moments of tension and conflict, it's in those moments of listening to one another that real ministry, real meeting happens. Now, for some folks, this realistic plan was too far. Conservative factions in the United Methodist Church, like the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the Good News and Confessing movements, are groups who have been lobbying for decades for not only preserving but strengthening the discriminatory language and rules in the Book of Discipline. These groups indicated in advance of this special session in 2019 that they would only support either a much harsher crackdown on LGBTQ clergy and lay people and allies, or an option to leave the denomination, which had not previously been open to them because of our understanding that our property is held in trust by the annual conference. So it's difficult to leave the United Methodist Gate and keep your building. So the former option became the traditionalist plan, and it was full of rules and punishments for those who hold a more progressive theology and seek to have it enacted in the world. Now, much of this plan was unconstitutional. That means it was standing outside of the Constitution of the United Methodist Church that we adopted in 1968. It was incongruent with those historical positions and guidelines that we had agreed to as United Methodist. But nevertheless, it was presented. Some people believe that it was not actually intended to be the plan that stood on the floor of this special general conference, but the plan that made it possible for people to vote for something a little bit closer to center. When I read the plan for the first time, I thought, where is the space for God's not done yet? Where's the space for God to say anything new to us? Have we really got it all figured out? Where's the space for grace? Gordon and I yesterday went to our district resource day. So it was put on by our district superintendent and a group that helps to resource clergy and lay people for the ministry that we're doing right now. And our keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Albert Mosley, gave us this beautiful new interpretation for the parable of the sower. And what struck me about what he said was really beautiful. He said, it's a good thing, isn't it, that I'm not in charge of grace. It's a good thing that nobody that you or I know is in charge of grace. Because if it was up to me, how many times in the middle of a bad mood swing or a fight with somebody, would somebody have been left out? Somebody not have been able to come to the table because of my feelings, understandings, right? It's a good thing I'm not in charge of grace. And it's a good thing that God has been so wanton and reckless with grace, because when I recognize how gracious God has been to me, when I recognize how much God has welcomed me into a place where I didn't feel like I deserved to be, when I recognize how much God forgave me, even though I was being, even when I first became a Christian, I was being pious and showy about my faith and I didn't really understand what was happening. When I realize how much God has done for me, then how do I have any right to turn anyone else away? So now we have the one church plan and the traditionalist plan. So finally, LGBTQ clergy and allies put forth their simple plan, which very simply would have removed the discriminatory language towards LGBTQ persons and removed restrictions on ordination and officiating same-sex weddings. So under this plan, no clergy person would be required to celebrate a same-sex wedding, and no bishop would be required to ordain LGBTQ persons if it was outside their theology to do so. But neither would LGBTQ persons be prohibited from marrying or becoming ordained. And while this plan was simple and had very few petitions to pass, most of us knew coming into General Conference this year that this plan would not pass. You see, this debate has been going on for 47 years. We all know the players and we all know the arguments. For decades, this battle has come before the General Conference, and for decades, the church has left the conference roughly 50-50. For the past 15 years or so, it's been skewing a little bit more towards the conservative church, and those regulations have become a little bit stronger. In the past 15 years, the conservative church has become more and more convinced that the only path to a holy church is for the progressive branch of the church to leave, or for the progressive branch of the church to comply with a conservative theology. And in those same 15 years, as the doors of marriage have been opened to all people, the progressive church has become more and more convinced that all people should have access to marriage and ordination, and that the church will die if we do not change. So here are these two groups of people seemingly with their backs turned on one another, two intractable positions, three possible plans of action. And here you have the stage set for General Conference 2019. So 2 weeks ago in St. Louis, delegates from around the world came together to discuss these three plans. And as usual, we yelled with each other and tore each other down on the floor of General Conference. And as most folks expected, the votes were split about 55-45, or sometimes 53-47, just this tiny, tiny little margin that represents the diversity in our denomination. The traditional plan passed, and LGBTQ people, clergy, lay people, and allies have been devastated. And the conservative church has said, we're not leaving. The denomination is becoming closer to the one that we want. But if you all are uncomfortable, you can go. I didn't have really high hopes for the General Conference, I'll admit. I've been to a couple of General Conferences. I've seen the way people throw arguments at each other, and it's just painful all around. I didn't expect that there was going to be tons for LGBTQ people to gain at General Conference. We knew the simple plan wasn't going to pass, and the One Church plan doesn't really do a ton for actually helping LGBTQ people. And so I didn't have a great expectation that we would do anything remarkably different. Nevertheless, when I watched and listened to what was happening in St. Louis, I found myself just heartbroken. I thought, where is God in all of this? I thought, we have been fighting for so long, and where is God? Has God not stepped into the middle of this intractable debate in the last 47 years? Where is God? And what do we do now? Do we stay? Do we leave? If our conference stays in the United Methodist Church, do we go with their conference? There were so many questions running through my head at the end of General Conference. And I stopped, and I prayed, and I stayed quiet and stayed off social media for a couple of days. I thought, we're about to enter the season of Lent. General Conference has been this big, showy gesture. Everybody knows where everybody stands now. It's all on the table. So what does God want us to take out of this ritual? Where is God speaking in our lives now? And the answer came to me as you all came to my office and sent me emails and called the office to talk about what happened at General Conference. And the pain in your voices and the desire to be a part of the continuing story of God and God's love for all people told me that God doesn't have to be in the middle of the General Conference. In fact, that's a really loud space for God to compete over all of our screaming voices. God is right here. God is not in showy rituals. God is in our relationships with people. I thought about, during our reconciling process, how many of you told me that your own hearts had been changed by your knowledge and relationship with LGBTQ people. I thought, that's where God is speaking. When we listen to the text of Isaiah 58, God says, I'm tired of your fasts. I'm tired of your rituals. I'm tired of your showy gestures. Do you really want to have a fast that's consecrated to me? Do you really want to do the thing that's pleasing to me? I'll tell you what you should do. Break the chains of oppression. Teach and preach and live freedom that I have given you. Don't just show your faith in a moment, but live your faith across a lifetime. See all people through the lens of love. See all people through the lens of love. And so regardless of what happens next, this local congregation will continue to do the work that I have seen you do over the last 3 years, in fact, over the last decades. You continue to see all people through the lens of love. I want to offer you an opportunity to ask a couple of questions if you have them. Is there anybody who has a question? There's a lot that we still don't know. Yeah, Bruce. Yeah. So Bruce is reminding us that it's typical after a general conference for all of the legislation that's passed to be reviewed by a team, and then some of the legislation is sent to Judicial Council, which is kind of like the United Methodist Supreme Court. It's sent to the Judicial Council to review and make sure that everything that we passed at General Conference is in line with our Book of Discipline. And so the entire traditional plan was sent to the Judicial Council, and their meeting is at the end of April. It's just after Easter. So there's a lot that we don't know yet about how this plan will be implemented or will be handed down for implementation to the annual conferences. So we'll know a lot more at the end of April. Anybody else have a question? Yeah, Kate.
So if the traditional plan was unconstitutional, does that mean there's any chance that it could be found invalid or parts of it?
Yeah. So Kate asks if the traditional plan was unconstitutional, is there a chance that it gets sort of overturned by the Judicial Council and we don't implement it? Yeah. So one of the, if you're a polity nerd like me, one of the interesting conversations was, so the traditional plan is made up of all of these petitions, like 4 petitions, to change the Book of Discipline in each specific place. So one of the questions was, does it have to be taken as a whole, or can it be broken up into parts and we only adopt parts of it? So that's the question that's one question that the Judicial Council will take up. Do we have to look at the traditional plan as a whole, or can we adopt just the small parts of it? If you have to adopt the whole thing as a whole, there are some people out there who believe that the Judicial Council will find that too much of it is unconstitutional to implement. There are pieces of it that are constitutional, including the piece that expands the definition of self-avowed and practicing homosexual, which is the terminology that's used to keep LGBTQ people from becoming ordained. So that piece is constitutional. So if it gets accepted piecemeal, that's one of the major changes that will move forward. So whether or not it's considered legal in the United Methodist Church has a varying impact on whether people will follow it, right? So on the floor of General Conference, representatives from the Western jurisdiction, that's all the conferences that are like basically from Colorado west, right? The Western jurisdiction stood on the floor and said, basically, thank you, General Conference, but we're going to continue to practice how we have been practicing for the last 20 years. We're still going to ordain LGBTQ people. We're still going to allow our pastors and our churches to celebrate same-sex unions. So come join us if you want. It was a call to sort of all the progressive churches to come look at the Western jurisdiction and to sign on to what they're doing and be a part of the conversation there. And recently, our own New England Annual Conference has released a statement saying, we're going to continue in our practices. LGBTQ people are still welcome in our church. Yeah.
What are some of the important parts that would probably be unconstitutional?
Yeah, so the parts that would be unconstitutional are likely have to do with punishments for the particular infractions from the Book of Discipline. So the traditional plan sought to implement stricter punishments and a more tight control on what's called the complaint process. So if you raise a complaint about a clergy person or a lay person to the bishop, there were stricter processes about how that happened. Also, some rules about who's allowed to sit on the Board of Ordained Ministry. So they asked for sort of a litmus test to be placed on the Board of Ordained Ministry, which is the group that decides who gets to be ordained, right? Yeah, so those are some things that we're thinking might be unconstitutional, might not be implemented. Any other questions? Yeah, Paula.
So assuming this did go through and pass this test in terms of legality,
Right.
what does that mean to churches like us that become reconciling churches?
Yeah. So that's the question right now, Paula. So and to reiterate, Paula says, so if this is constitutional and if it is implemented, what does it mean for congregations like ours who have voted to be reconciling? So the short answer is we don't know yet. The longer answer is We'll see more at annual conversations that are happening right now among leaders of reconciling congregations and sort of leaders of the broader social justice movement within the church, who are thinking about what's the best course of action. A lot of us had sort of expected that the conservative church had put forward these sort of off-ramps, these exit ramps to the church, that we expected that the Wesleyan Covenant Association was going to say, okay, well, the United Methodist Church is not going in the direction that we wanted it to, and so we're going to take this off-ramp now. We're going to leave the denomination. After St. Louis, the Wesleyan Covenant Association said, nope, that worked out really well for us. We're building the church that we want to see, and we're not going to leave. But progressive churches, you can leave if you want. And so the conversation now is sort of, do progressive churches and progressive leaders stay as a part of the United Methodist Church to continue to fight that battle, to fight that system, or to continue to try to find common ground? Or is it time for these churches to go their separate ways, right? And there are a variety of I think, proposals that people are sort of considering now, and that legislation or that those ideas haven't been perfected and brought to us. So the church is at a crossroads. This is a really exciting, difficult, and time in the United Methodist Church, but it's a time full of possibility. It's also a time when churches like ours, it's really good that we're grounded in the place that we are. It's really good that we had this discussion a year ago, right? So that we know who we are and where we're going. And our annual conference will help us to discern that. Yeah, Mickey.
So I'm always struggling to understand the like, for Wesleyan conference, like what their rationale. Like, I just want to understand the opposite opinion as much as I can.
Yeah.
And so, are they basing it more on biblical references, or are there like internal documents to the Methodist Church, documents written by Wesley or others later that they're saying that LGBTQ is incompatible? Is it all coming from the Old Testament and St. Paul, or is it coming from internal church stuff?
That's a really good question. So I don't want to mischaracterize anybody. I believe that there are faithful leaders in the United Methodist Church who believe differently than, say, I do, right? There tends to be a strain of biblical literalism that goes along with the Wesleyan Covenant Association, right? They also tend to believe that the covenant that we have made as clergy people and as lay people with one another is based on the Book of Discipline as we have adopted it right now. And so it's frustrating to them that churches would stand outside of that, would practice same-sex weddings in their space, or their pastors would officiate that, or that LGBTQ people would come for ordination, because we have rules against that, and we have made a covenant with each other with those restrictions, right? And so it's difficult for them that people are breaking relationship. That, in conjunction with this sort of tendency towards biblical literalism, are sort of two of the pillars that are upholding that thought.
The Book of Discipline is the really key one.
It's hard to explain. It's a little nuanced, but I think these are at least the arguments that I hear on the floor of General Conference, right? Are that we have to be true to what God has said in God's Word, and we have to be true to our covenant that we have with each other in the Book of Discipline. Okay. So thanks for entering into that conversation and for learning a little bit more about where we are. Our conference is going to have a courageous conversation later this month, and you'll get an announcement in your update that will talk about the time and date of that. So if you want to enter into further conversation, our conference leaders will be leading that conversation in Marlborough later this month, and I encourage you to attend. And we'll continue to keep you informed, of course, of what happens at the annual conference level and what that means for us. But regardless, none of this, I should have said this earlier, none of this will even possibly go into effect until January 1st, 2020. So that's what was adopted at the General Conference.